From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from New York.
From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. It is the day after. Donald Trump, while the votes are still being counted, is now President-elect Trump once again. And Kaylee, we still have some major races to be called as we try to figure the balance of power on Capitol Hill.
Well, that's absolutely right. As we look at the states that have been called for Donald Trump, it includes two of the three bricks of the blue wall, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. He, of course, has 277 electoral votes called for him right now. That is more than enough to secure the presidency. But in those very same states, the Senate races remain too close to call, as the Democratic incumbents there and in Michigan, even in Nevada, are still in very, very tight contests. And we, of course, might be days away from knowing who ultimately wins the majority in the House of Representatives and whether or not this could turn into a red sweep.
That's true. A lot of conventional wisdom busted over the last 24 hours here. We can even put the presidential race aside for a moment, and that was a remarkable, if not historic, comeback in political history here in the United States of America. But the Senate, remember, was supposed to go just barely Republican, more seats than expected, it appears. And we don't know what's going to happen with the House. It's supposed to be not the hardest job of the night for Democrats to turn the House. But whether this is a red wave or, as I think Mike Allen called it, a red shock, we're dealing with a very different set of circumstances today.
Well, and certainly many people may find themselves shocked in the aftermath of this. I would point out we do expect to hear from Vice President Kamala Harris this afternoon at 4 p.m. Eastern time, when she will speak from Howard University. We have yet to hear of a formal concession from Harris. But again, the presidency has been called for Donald Trump. And frankly, he called it for himself even before the networks did, addressing supporters last night in West Palm Beach.
America has given us an unprecedented and powerful mandate. We have taken back control of the Senate. Wow, that's good. And the Senate races in Montana, Nevada, Texas, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, were all won by the MAGA movement. They helped so much.
To Kaylee's point, that was before the networks called the race. The Associated Press at 5:34 a.m. Eastern Time, naming Donald Trump the winner of this contest. Of course, a lot of this has to do with Pennsylvania. The big prize last night. That's where we find Bloomberg's David Gura on the ground in Philadelphia. David, how do you do it?
Well, there was so much faith placed in Philadelphia, where I'm standing, in the suburbs around here. And when you look at the numbers of those who turned out for Kamala Harris yesterday, they were much lower than they were back in 2016 when Hillary Clinton was the candidate. And I think that's going to cause a lot of soul searching within the Democratic Party. This is a bulwark of support for Democrats historically. And I think that Kamala Harris and her campaign were really counting on many more votes here than they got. And I say that's going to cause some deep contemplation here in the postmortem. They also just have to look at their entire ground game in this state. It's something that they trumpeted so much over the course of these last few days, how much money and resources they pumped into getting out the vote here in Pennsylvania and moving beyond Philadelphia and the suburbs and exurbs to other parts of this state. They just didn't have the turnout among Democrats that they thought that they would, didn't get the kind of votes that they thought they would. And so it's kind of emblematic, I think, of what we've seen in a number of other Rust Belt states across this country. There was a lot of optimism on the part of the candidate. I don't know that you want to attribute it to bad polling necessarily. I think it's more just a sense among the Harris campaign that they had this sewn up more than they did. Yes, there was cautious optimism about how this was going to go, but I think that they felt more confident in what the results are going to be. And if I could, I'll just talk about the Senate race here as well. I mean, that's it had been on a razor's edge. It seemed like it was leaning toward Bob Casey, the incumbent Democrat. We saw that narrow in recent weeks, and now it seems like Dave McCormick has this all but sewn up. He has not declared victory yet. I'll note that in Wisconsin, we had Tammy Baldwin kind of following in the footsteps of Donald Trump, going out before that race was called by the AP. That's not happened here. So we're waiting on votes here from Cambria County. That is due east of Pittsburgh. Still just 35% of those votes are in. But I think if I'm if I were to guess what the McCourtney campaign is thinking here, they think that the path forward here looks pretty good, and they're well on their way to declaring victory in Pennsylvania.
All right, Bloomberg's David Gura in Pennsylvania. Thank you. The Senate race there, as you mentioned, still too close to call. The same goes for the Senate race in Michigan. Alyssa Slotkin right now up by 1/10 of a percentage point against Mike Rogers. And of course, the state of Michigan overall hasn't been called in the presidential race, though it doesn't need to, as Donald Trump has already had the Electoral College called for him. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick is in Detroit, Michigan at noon Eastern on the East Coast. Romaine, what's going on?
Yeah, about in that Senate race, only about 10,000, fewer than 10,000 votes right now, separating Republican Mike Rogers from Democrat Alyssa Slotkin. Of course, this will take some time to sort out. This was a hotly contested race. But there's really a big issue here. And Joe, you started off the program talking about this red wave or red shock. I think a better sort of descriptor, at least here in Michigan, is the red wake-up call, at least for the Democrats here. Because in that Senate race, Slotkin outspent Rogers by a factor of almost 5-1. In fact, Democrats overall, in most of the races, outspent their Republican counterparts. And well, as you already know, they don't have a lot to show it. Of course, Slotkin hasn't technically lost the race yet, but the fact that it's even this close says a lot here about, well, just how little that money actually did. As for Trump and Harris, that was also a very contested election with a lot of the campaign spending being directed towards very specific areas. Trump spent a lot of time in Dearborn, the heavily Arab and Muslim American population area. He also spent a lot of time in Novi, as well as in a few others in the western part of the state. Those areas really helped him to close the gap with Harris, not just in this election, but more importantly, Trump actually outperformed his performance from 2020 and in 2016, and that's got to give the Democrats a bit of pause as they try to figure out what exactly happened here last night.
Romaine Bostick on the ground in Detroit, Michigan. Your reporting has been indispensable, Romaine. Thank you so much. As we consider, as Romaine said, the red wake-up call, Donald Trump had any number of economic policy proposals that we've talked about over the past couple of months that brought us to this point. Here's a taste.
What I'm going to do is something that nobody has ever even thought about doing. No tax on tips. As part of our additional tax cuts, we will end all taxes on overtime. I want to cut taxes on Americans while putting tariffs on China and foreign countries to bring our jobs back home.
My plan is to make the Trump tax cuts permanent. They are massive tax cuts, biggest ever, permanent. And to cut taxes even more, a reduction in the corporate tax rate from 21% to 15%. No tax on Social Security benefits.
Restoring the SALT deduction, saving thousands of dollars for residents of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and other high-cost states. As part of our tax cuts, we will make interest on car loans fully deductible.
And joining us now, Joe Lavorgna, Chief Economist with SMBC Nikko Securities America, the former Chief Economist of the White House National Economic Council in the first Trump administration. Nice to see you at the table here. I bet you've been up all night. I can only imagine what the last 24 hours have been like for you.
Thank you for having me. I was on earlier in the week sitting over there.
Absolutely. Well, nice. You know this table very well, and you've been generous with your time over the course of this cycle. We've got a lot of questions for you here, beginning with this market reaction. This is a monster move to see a day in which the Dow's up over 1,000 points, the S&P 500 is up some 2%, but the bond market is moving in the other direction. We're looking at a 4.5 here as of this moment on the 10-year. What do you make specifically of the reaction in the bond market? This is clearly in anticipation of some sort of inflationary event.
Well, here's the thing. When I was talking with investors and clients, as I do, that's most of my day job, the simple question is, what happens if Harris wins? What happens if Trump wins? And my initial read, in very simplistic terms, was Harris, bad for equities, good for bonds. Trump, good for equities, bad for bonds. And that related to the fact on where I see growth and also how the market initially would react to things. So, for example, with Trump, equities are up because the market's more excited about growth, lower tax rates, less regulation, et cetera. But the bond market gets worried about more spending, tax cuts, et cetera. And like the CBO, for example, they're going to initially probably score a Trump budget as being, more deficit-related spending. The Tax Foundation found that. The problem with it is that we don't know the specifics yet. And I'd argue if you look back at the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 and you see what CBO scored the revenue numbers in 16, we actually got the money in 18. In other words, the tax cut paid for itself. So I think these are knee-jerk reactions, and then we'll see what happens once we get some meat to the bone.
Well, so as you consider the timeline you just said there, knowing that there was $8 trillion in deficit added during the first Trump administration, the Committee for Responsible Budget says it could be another $15 trillion, if not all of it pays for itself. But it is a question of time, especially knowing these markets are discounting mechanisms. They are looking well ahead. So when we consider sequencing here, things like tariffs, that could potentially hit the economy first before the actual beneficiary impacts of lower taxes is fully felt and recognized in corporate profits and the like, right? How should we think about the way in which this plays out?
Right. So you're absolutely right. Markets are forward-looking, and they may fear or they could think that, okay, tariffs are inflationary. It's a one-off price adjustment. But again, it would be how are the tariffs implemented? And what would the U.S. be getting in return? I think there's this misperception that day one of Trump, we're going to have tariffs across the board, X%, and this is my guess, and in China it's going to be at least 60%, maybe higher. To me, it's going to be more nuanced. It's going to be very transactional. In other words, tariffs are going to be used in large part as a tool to essentially have more fair trade. So, for example, the U.S. has certain environmental regulations and certain rules against child labor. Some of our trading partners don't have those same rules, and we're at a disadvantage. So to the extent tariffs can level the playing field and make trade fair, I think that makes sense. Also, it would depend, too, what happens with energy policy. If we have a significant amount of drilling and energy production, that will offset the tariffs, even if the tariffs, for argument's sake, were implemented across the board. The energy share of the economy is bigger than the import share of the economy. So it really depends how it's going to be put into place. And I always tell people, look at things, the broad policy set. Like, don't focus just on the tariffs. Don't focus just on the tax cuts. Look at the holistic approach in terms of trying to increase productive capacity.
I guess a simpler way, though, of asking my question would be, are we likely to feel the inflation before we feel the growth?
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe so because if energy prices stay low, that will immediately hit people's pocketbooks in a positive way. Prices will come down. The general rule of thumb is every 1 penny change in gasoline is worth about $1 billion in terms of an energy tax cut. So if you get prices down 50 cents, may not seem like a lot, but in a $25 trillion economy, that's basically like a $50 billion tax cut immediately.
What do you make of the moves in the banks today? This is wild. Goldman Sachs up 13% right now. I could go down a long list of them. Is Basel III dead, if it wasn't already?
Yeah, I think Basel III is dead, or like in The Princess Bride, it's mostly dead.
Yeah.
But look, the financials are, isn't it a great movie? The financials are essentially a high beta on the economy. So if you believe, and again, I'm trying to be objective here, if you're looking at the equity market's up on the expectation of stronger growth, and the financials are a high beta to GDP. So if we sustain 3% GDP or higher, and inflation does moderate, as I think it will, then the banks are doing what they're supposed to do.
Well, so as we consider potential policy here and regulation, we've talked with you before, Joe, about some of the other policy ideas that have been put forward, like on immigration, for example, the ideas that around mass deportation and the economic impact it ultimately could have if millions of people who are contributing to the labor force right now, who are paying into things like Social Security, were to leave the country. How should we be gaming that out and the realism of trying to get that many people out of the country in an expeditious manner?
Joe Lavorgna, private citizen, doesn't expect mass deportation. My strong sense and gut instinct is that we're going to enforce the laws. We're going to make sure, the administration will make sure that there is more legal immigration that comes through. However, there are a lot of potential bad actors, as we know, not to get into details, that need to be removed, and I think law enforcement will do so. But I do not personally, this is me, Joe Lavorgna speaking, do not expect mass deportation. The other factor I want to mention is that if you look at labor force participation, we're about 3/4 of a point below where we were pre-COVID. That's over 1 million workers. So if the economy can grow and we can get labor force participation to rise further, that would offset any modest effect that we may not be getting through immigration and will clearly be benefiting the U.S. workers that are here.
This would be a very different FTC than we have right now. When I mentioned Goldman earlier, I'm thinking IPOs, I'm thinking mergers and acquisitions. Is that what we mean when we say animal spirits?
Yeah, animal spirits, confidence in the outlook, yeah.
What's the M&A situation going to look like in Trump 2.0?
Well, certainly there will be much more M&A activity. I don't think. To me, it's going to be more entrepreneurial. I mean, I always would tell people, when I highlighted this when I was in the administration, if you looked at small business sentiment, it was the highest under President Trump than any administration. So there is, I think, a dynamism and an animal spirit that is reflective in an entrepreneurialism a type of role, and that is going to be, I think, beneficial to activity that allows people to transact. And by the way, unlike tariffs and things like that, this sounds pretty basic. I don't think this is insightful, but President Trump's a businessman, and I think you have to look at the transactional nature of how he approaches things. And there was a great quote from a reporter of the Pittsburgh Gazette, I believe, 8 years ago, said, don't take President Trump literally, but take him seriously. And I find too often we get caught up in the rhetoric and get caught up in things that divide us. I don't really believe that to be the case in the second term, or at least I hope.
As we consider entrepreneurialism, being able to jumpstart things, we have to look at the cost of capital. And that brings me to something that's coming up tomorrow, as if we all haven't had enough this week, a Federal Reserve decision. They're expected to cut 25 basis points. The market is now pricing in fewer cuts over the course of the next year, Joe, in part maybe due to the outcome of this election. What do you think about the path?
No question. The market is expecting faster growth. I think it's perhaps incorrectly expecting inflation is going to be higher, but is expecting faster growth and then less inflation. And because the president's going to try to make permanent, I think he will, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. There's no big tax hike coming in 26, and therefore there's no fiscal cliff, which means there's less pressure on the Fed to cut. So I think initially the Fed will probably cut less. They'll cut 25 tomorrow. To me, December is probably a pause, and then we'll reevaluate and we'll see, where personnel is in the Trump administration and what policies are advocated, because right now this is still guesswork.
Pretty interesting to consider what will happen over the course of the next month. Your phone's going to be ringing. What job would you want in a Trump administration? Again.
I said this the other day. I said, look, I'm very happy where I am and being honored to serve. Yeah. And we'll just play it by ear. We'll see. I love the markets. I love coming on. I like having a nice conversation with you guys. And certainly if the president called, it would be hard to say no. But right now I'm happy, and we'll see what happens. I feel like, I like to think I've got some options, but we'll see.
So we'll see you on the North Lawn at some point soon.
Hopefully not cut. Well, I won't say it. Thank you.
Either way, we always welcome you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We appreciate you joining us on this day after the election. Joe Lavorgna, of course, formerly of the Trump White House, now at SMBC Nikko Securities on this day after the election, a day in which markets are ripping, the S&P 500 at a fresh record high, and the bond market seeing big moves with the 10-year yield up 17 basis points. We'll have more ahead on the markets and the politics with our political panel next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kayleigh Lyons at Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. They are still counting votes. We still have some important Senate races to be called here, Kayleigh, but the transition on the presidential level has already begun. Donald Trump is now officially the president-elect.
Yep, having won 277 Electoral College votes at this point, but it is expected he could win many more than that. For all of our months of discussion about how this race was incredibly tight, going to be decided by very close margins, the margins Donald Trump was able to put up over the last 24 hours have been pretty remarkable, adding to what he experienced in 2016 and 2020. And it's not just the Electoral College we're watching here, but the popular vote, which he is currently winning by roughly 5 million votes. He did not get the popular vote in the first two cycles he ran in.
Defying most predictions that we described here on the air, talking to various pollsters who do this for a living, confounding us to the point where it's now being called the red wave, or as Romaine Bostick called it from Detroit, a red wake-up call. Things went late into the night. You probably didn't get much sleep yourself. The whole nation is bleary-eyed this morning. J.D. Vance got up to the podium while Donald Trump was delivering his victory speech last night in West Palm Beach. Let's listen.
Well, Mr. President, I appreciate you allowing me to join you on this incredible journey. I thank you for the trust that you placed in me. And I think that we just witnessed the greatest political comeback in the history of the United States of America.
Joining us now for more, our political panel, Democratic strategist and partner at ROKK Solutions, Kristen Hawn, alongside Republican strategist and West Front Strategies principal, Ashley Davis. Thank you both for being with us on this day after. Ashley, just to begin with you, J.D. Vance calls it the greatest political comeback in the history of the United States, and he is not alone in characterizing this in that way. After a loss in 2020, after January 6, 2021, Donald Trump is going to be the 47th president of the United States. What does it say to you?
He's also going to be a very decisive president of the United States. I mean, the win, which I think is probably good or bad, is good for the country in regards to there's no question about who won. And that's really not a political statement. I would say the same thing if Kamala would have won. The fact that it's not hanging on chads or anything else is a good sign. But yeah, it is a huge political comeback. I mean, who would have thought, how many times was he indicted? How many times has...
He's been convicted on 34 felony counts.
Yeah, and indicted more.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, just the fact that he was able to do this and come back, I actually think it shows, one, how he does talk and resonate with parts of this country that a lot of us don't talk to every day, and also just how upset the country was. And I think that's what shows. And I think that we, a collective, we probably need to take a look at the people that have spoken about how unhappy they are and want the change in our country.
Yeah. Kristen Hawn, a lot of Democrats are feeling bruised this day after. It's not just the presidency, it's Congress. You spent quite a good amount of time on Capitol Hill as a blue dog Democrat. How do you see this today?
I think you've already seen kind of the blame game starting, the finger pointing. I think, as Democrats, we need to take a look, like what Ashley said. Why were the people not happy? What are we talking to them about? How are we talking to them? And really think about that. This automatic, some of the talking points I've seen out there from some Democrats saying, we just didn't lean into the progressive, the liberal side enough, I think is the wrong lesson to take from this. There were no more votes to be got from there. We need to think about how we are listening and talking to the American people all across the country. I think there was a lot of fear-mongering. I think that there was a lot of misinformation out there, and I think it'll take us months, if not years, to figure out what we need to do, particularly heading into the midterms.
Well, and I wonder how you're reacting to the demographic breakdown we've seen in exit polls. Kristen, it's looking like Kamala Harris, who would have been the first female president in the United States if she had won, is going to win fewer female votes than Joe Biden did in 2020 for all of the talk about momentum among women. What does that say to you?
Well, I mean, I think there's also she had, one of the shortest runs for the presidency, and I think that probably hampered her ability to really define herself beyond, Joe Biden. I think also, we were fresh off of 4 years with President Trump, and people were sick of it, and they voted that way. So I think it's not necessarily her. I think it was, you look at what's happening at the time and when it's happening. And I unfortunately think that we're going to get 2 years with the midterms and 4 years down the road, and people are going to be reminded of how exhausted they are with having to wake up and listen to President Trump every day.
Ashley, your thoughts on the gender battle? This had really devolved into a men versus women election, we were told, and a lot of Democrats are asking today, a lot of women are asking, why is America not capable of getting its arms around this idea of electing a female president?
I wish I knew, because I obviously believe in that a lot. I actually think, though, that what people thought was going to get her across the finish line, though, was the abortion issue or the Dodd's ruling. And I think what happened, and obviously there's going to be days to come which we can look at this data, but it looks like many women, even in the suburban areas, cared more about security, the border, the economy, than they even did kind of these rights. And also, I do believe the American people, as a pro-choice Republican, understand that now this is in the states, right? I mean, I don't think that people are, the rhetoric that went around about the Dobbs decision, how no one's ever going to be able to have, female rights, is just not correct. And so I think people aren't believing that message. But listen, I think the biggest, the biggest demographic that came out of yesterday is 1 in 3 of color voters voted for Trump. I mean, that was high in 2004 when Bush won re-elect, but it hasn't been that high since. And I think that that's pretty...
It's remarkable for a
It's
Republican.
remarkable.
We should remind our audience as well, you did support a woman for president. You were a Nikki Haley supporter at the beginning of this campaign. Is there a place for you in this party?
Listen, I'm just like her. I mean, I'm a conservative. I believe in conservatism in regards to financial conservatism. I'm very socially liberal, but I do believe in Republican policies. And so at the end of the day, am I happy that there's a Republican Senate? Absolutely. Do I not believe in some of Kamala Harris's policies? Absolutely. Yep. But I do believe in a woman becoming president. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But at the end of the day, I'm a Republican. I'm going to support Republicans.
Well, as Ashley raises the Senate, Kristen, we already know that the Senate is gone for the Democrats. It has been flipped. The question now is the margin. And the bigger question is the House. What races will you be watching that have yet to be called?
I'm watching a lot of races where people are doing well. Jim Costa in California always does well. Henry Cuellar won in Texas, which is great. You look at people who are really strong, like Mary Peltola out in Alaska, who, Lisa Murkowski said she wanted her to be back in the House. So races like those, I think, there are a number of them that were flipped last night. It'll be several days, if not weeks, before we know who has control of the House. But I think at the end of the day, as a House person, those members and those candidates who really know their districts and really speak to the voters on a local level will be the ones who ultimately pull out the win here. And for Democrats, obviously, control of the House is really important so that we don't have Donald Trump as president completely unchecked in his power.
You know what the loudest question I'm hearing from Democrats today is, Kristen Hawn? What would have happened if she picked Josh Shapiro?
I'm not sure it would have made that much of a difference, honestly. I think we had a really strong team and a strong vice presidential candidate in Tim Walz. So, I think that any conversations within my party about what if is not productive at this point. We need to all be sitting down at the table and being like, what happened here? And what do we need to do differently?
Well, and then there's the question of what happens next. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, we know, Ashley, but who is likely to be in this cabinet as this transition gets underway?
I think you'll see a lot of governors and you'll see a lot of senators, especially if the Senate does end up being 54 Republicans, say. Obviously, McCormick's very close to winning in Pennsylvania and maybe Nevada or maybe not. We'll see. But I think that those are going to be easy to confirm. And I also think that it gives you a little bit of room to have a vacancy in regards to other votes if the senators are going up for some sort of confirmation. I don't think if the numbers stay this close one way or the other, and going back to Kristen's comment, I think we're down to like 9 races in the House, from what I understand, about, what's going to happen, and I think no matter what happens, it's going to be very close. But you can't take very many House members out of, no matter, if you're a Republican, unless we're in the minority. I think you see Elise Stefanik go somewhere.
Interesting.
She wants what, UN ambassador?
That sounds right. Nice to have you in New York today. We're lucky. Thank you. Ashley Davis with us, of course, and Kristen Hawn, our panel today on Balance of Power, the day after the race. The market reaction has been wild. A lot of talk about animal spirits here as we turn to Bloomberg Markets reporter Abigail Doolittle with the latest. Abigail?
Animal spirits is a good way to put it. The risk rally, Trump trade, lots of good ways to talk about today's move for markets. Stocks in particular rallying in a big way. The S&P 500 up more than 2%, the best day since early August. You also have that Russell 2000 rallying more, up about 5%. So what we have here, stocks rallying on certainty, but there's also that Trump trade truly in effect showing with that Russell 2000. Those small cap companies tend to be more domestically based. So his anticipated protectionist policy, tariffs, that would be good for those companies. But take a look at the KBW Bank Index. Banks really higher. And that has to do with the idea that perhaps there's going to be less regulation. But it's not just stocks. If you go cross-asset, you can take a look at bonds. They are selling off. That is risk on. It means folks are not looking for haven bonds. You could also make the argument it has to do with the anticipation of more spending, so those yields higher. And then it's also The dollar, the best day since 2020. At the highs, the best day since 2016. Again, having to do with protectionism, putting the U.S. first. Bitcoin, a record high. Trump media and Tesla not to be left out. Of course, Elon Musk, a big part of the campaign, but Trump media up 7%. Tesla up 14%. Lots and lots of green on the screen.
Yeah, pretty incredible to consider. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much. This market reaction began early in the evening last night, even before the race was called for Donald Trump. And certainly we're only seeing these trades intensify. But when we look at crypto, which Abigail just mentioned, a record high for Bitcoin at $74,500 and change dollars right now, up about 8 percentage points in this session. It, of course, has been a real proxy for the Trump trade, perhaps was out in front of his now apparent victory long before we actually understood that's what it would be. And crypto has played a massive role in this cycle. When we look at some of the other races we got outcomes for last night in Ohio, the Senate Banking Committee chair, Sherrod Brown, ousted by a crypto entrepreneur in Bernie Moreno, a race in which there was a ton of crypto money in play.
Yeah, there's been some wild moves here as well. And to see the VIX dropping to 16 here, down 21%, gives you a sense of not only animal spirits, but a sense of relief in this stock market. It's the bond market that confounds us a bit, as we discussed with Joe Lavorgna, and you wonder to what extent this is a first-day knee-jerk reaction. Yeah, certainly you're seeing a lot of upward pressure on yields, and the bond market, of course, is also bracing for a Federal Reserve decision tomorrow and a press conference from Jerome Powell. I don't know if I feel like it's going to be easier for Powell to navigate that press conference because there is a clear winner in the presidential race, or if this is going to make it all the more tricky make the whole news conference
to forecast
about politics,
future of policy.
Yeah.
Certainly Jerome Powell would prefer it not be about politics.
Glad
but
Michael McKee will be there.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we still have much more ahead here on Balance of Power. Frank Luntz will join us to help unpack the results next on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons, and it is the day after, the day in which we now know Donald Trump is the president-elect, will be the 47th president of the United States after winning at least 277 electoral college votes. The vote is not all the way in yet, Joe, but it is not just an electoral college victory we're looking at, but in all likelihood, a popular vote victory, as well as we await the final tally. However, we don't have the final tally for the ultimate majority in the Senate, as there is still a number of races to be called, or the majority in the House of Representatives. That's true. We do expect to hear from Vice President Kamala Harris a little bit later on today. She chose not to speak last night, which was an interesting element of the optics on our election night. She will be speaking at 4 p.m. Eastern time. We'll, of course, bring her remarks to you. It's unclear to us if she has conceded on a personal level to Donald Trump. We haven't heard news of a phone call, for instance. But I was struck following our coverage at about 4 o'clock in the morning Eastern time here, Kaylee, to see law enforcement surround Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue. It was clear, even if you were just walking the streets of New York, that something had changed. The transition is underway now, even as we wait for many other races to be called, including some key Senate races. We want to get into this with Bloomberg's Michael Shepard, who joins us now from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Shep was up all night with us, and it's great to see you, Mike. Your thoughts as we wait to hear from the vice president. Why are we waiting so long?
Well, I think one of the reasons for the delay, Joe, is just how difficult this is for the vice president and her campaign. This is not the speech they had been anticipating giving. Even yesterday afternoon, over the weekend, the campaign had seen some polls that suggested the race might be breaking a little bit more in her direction. And of course, now we know, based on the results, that was not the case. It's also going to be a challenge for her because you remember that for weeks, on the campaign trail and on the stump, she was warning voters that her opponent, Donald Trump, was unfit for office. So how she frames this speech, conceding to somebody she didn't think deserved the presidency, will be difficult to do, and to do graciously as well.
Well, this also may be a speech, Mike, that she wasn't prepared to have to give so soon, whether it is a concession speech or a victory speech. We thought the final result would take a lot longer than it did to figure out. Within 24 hours, we knew that Donald Trump would be president-elect. Can you just talk about briefly how much more efficiently it seems the votes were counted, how this election was won. By all accounts, it does seem like this was secure, this was safe. The democratic system worked.
Yeah, Kayleigh, I'm glad you brought that up because you know that for weeks we've been talking in the newsroom and everybody out there observing this election ahead of time was anticipating that it would be delayed the way it was in 2020. But what we've seen since then is state officials and state operations really tightened up their game, and they tried to prepare to ensure a faster, cleaner count that would be much more difficult to challenge. And we saw that. Another factor also was that it actually ended up being a much wider margin of victory, including in some of those battleground states that ultimately handed the presidency to Donald Trump.
Well, Michael, I don't know exactly, as we said, what we're going to hear from Vice President Kamala Harris a bit later, but we have heard from Donald Trump. How did the optics strike you on the stage last evening in West Palm Beach when the likes of Dana White joined the former president on the stage, along with the Speaker of the House? When you consider the contrast culturally of what we saw, how does it inform your expectations of a Trump 2.0?
Well, it highlighted the way that the former president has built this coalition, and he really has tried to cement the so-called MAGA brand in the Republican Party, and now for good. This victory in the presidential election seals it for many years to come. And certainly the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, is someone who is very much part of the Trump camp. And the other thing you mentioned, of course, was Dana White of the wrestling fame and ripping open his shirt on the convention stage in July. That points to how he had the former president had targeted male voters very directly. We called it, in a way, the bro campaign, and it worked. It helped push his numbers with male voters, and including with black men and Latino men as they headed to the polls yesterday. Mm-hmm.
All right, Bloomberg's Michael Shepard reporting from Washington, D.C. for us. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. And of course, we have been touching base not only with Mike Shepard and the rest of our Bloomberg team throughout this cycle, but our next guest as well. Frank Luntz, famed pollster and founder of FIL Inc., is joining us now. Frank, thanks for being back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. We have been talking about this entire cycle, how tight margins were likely to be. Turns out they're not quite as tight in most of these battleground states as they were in 2020. And I just wonder your takeaway here when it comes to whether or not the polls were adequately reflecting the reality in America. Once again, doesn't it seem like polls underestimated Donald Trump?
To a small degree, yes. And that is about turnout. That every Trump supporter became a Trump voter. But that is not the case with Kamala Harris. And that's one of the reasons why she fell short. Certainly the idea that Trump would get a majority of the popular vote is a surprise to a lot of people right now, and is the Iowa poll, which I want to draw attention to because that changed the actual narrative of the campaign for the last 48 hours. Trump ended up winning Iowa by about a dozen points or so. The poll had Harris up by 3. It was not only beyond the margin of error, it actually changed how the race was being covered, which is really one of the rare times when survey research actually becomes part of the narrative. I think that there's a lesson for Americans in the future, which is to spend a lot less time talking about who's winning and losing, and a lot more time talking about what the candidates say they're going to do and why either we should believe them or distrust them.
Sounds like people were wrong about a lot, Frank. They were wrong about the protesters showing up at the DNC. They were wrong about violence around polls, wrong about poll watchers, wrong about, in some cases, even though our polls were tied, the idea that there was momentum behind Kamala Harris as well. I'm wondering if there's a reckoning here for pollsters. Was there an overcorrection in the sample, and what's going through your mind today?
What's going through my mind, because I've been asked this in almost every show, is this is the media. The pollsters did get it wrong. But the media went all over this Iowa survey, went all over trying to see some trends, some movement in one direction or another, and that they're the ones who drove this. I tend not to talk about polling when I do shows like this. I talk about policy. I talk about language, what the public wants to see and hear. and whether the politicians are doing it or not. And so much of this is actually driven by those who ask the questions rather than people like me who answer them. Because we wouldn't answer them if we weren't asked them. I don't want to make a blanket statement because I take this so seriously. And I so approve of the way your show handles politics. It's one of the best shows in all of television for politics. But I do think that there needs to be a reckoning for what we choose to focus on and how we cover it, because in the end, it becomes misleading or even detrimental to the political process, as that Iowa survey clearly was.
Well, Frank, we appreciate the kind words. And of course, there always is room for critique when we consider how the narrative is shaped in America, and media plays a role in that as well. I think we can all agree. Earlier on in this cycle, there was a few conversations that happened in quick succession, one being whether or not the media was putting too much focus on the age issue for Joe Biden, then became whether or not the media was complicit in covering up how deep those issues may have run for the current president. And I just wonder, as we consider the role of Joe Biden in all of this, his late withdrawal from his reelection campaign, if ultimately you think that made a difference, if the timing mattered, or if it was never going to be possible for an incumbent administration, given the kind of inflation experienced during it, to keep hold of the White House.
I don't believe that. I challenge the narrative which has been put forward now for weeks. Vice President Harris had one of the sharpest, fastest rises of any candidate in modern history. She went from 5 points down when she got into the race to 3.5 points up in a matter of a few weeks because she was joyful. She talked about the things she wanted to do instead of the negativity, which she decried again and again. She was hopeful and optimistic and talked about all the things that she wanted to get done. But then after the convention, she turned dark. She turned negative. It sounded as much like a Trump campaign as it did a Harris campaign. And that was when she hit her ceiling. And then and by changing this, by being joyful and then being harshly negative, calling Trump a fascist, voters started to wonder, who is she? Is she authentic? Is she genuine? How do you go from being joyful to damning your opponents? And then Biden, of course, made the comment about Trump's voters. And it didn't ring true. That's number one. And number two is she never articulated exactly what she wanted to do in the first hour, in the first day, first week, first month, first 100 days, and so on. If she had done that in the CNN town hall, where it's done live, if she had done that in the 60 Minutes interview or the Fox interview, any of these, if she had done that and told voters exactly what she wanted to do, she would have done much better, because then it would have been about policy, and that's where she was weakest. But instead, she got driven around. She never answered the questions that voters had, and so she never crossed that threshold. Whereas Donald Trump, we knew him. There was nothing more we could learn about him. We knew his weaknesses, we knew his strengths, we knew his record because we saw it for 4 years. So her criticizing him didn't add anything to her, did not detract from him. And I think that that's one of the reasons why she lost.
The diagnosis from Frank Luntz on Bloomberg TV and radio. All of that said, Frank, what did we learn about our nation last night, particularly if this, in fact, was about men versus women?
I love that question. And that's a question that we need to be talking about over the coming weeks and months, because there's some things that are more important than an election. It's the next generation. And what are they learning? They're learning that it's okay to tear your opponent apart. They're learning that there is no bounds to negativity, that there are right and wrong ways. But they need to learn that there are right and wrong ways to approach politics, to approach economics, to approach day-to-day life. And I'm just afraid that what we now learned is the wrong thing, which is anything goes at any time for any reason. And that frightens me for the future.
Well, okay, so if we keep looking at demographics here and what the future may hold, Frank, I look at Donald Trump's victory in Miami-Dade last night. We haven't seen a Republican win that county for decades. It obviously is majority Hispanic. We did see a sizable break among Latinos for Donald Trump in a way we haven't seen in the past. Obviously, movement for black voters as well. And I wonder if you think those demographic shifts are unique to this candidate who is now president-elect, or if that may be something more permanent.
it's unique to this candidate, but also to this time, that it doesn't matter whether you're white, black, brown, it doesn't matter. If you have trouble affording food, to put food on your table, to put gas in your car, or the health care you need and the housing that you want, then it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. What matters is you're struggling. You're living paycheck to paycheck. And that's what's happening right now. And Donald Trump articulated an empathy to that much more explicitly than Harris did. She tried to run away from it. Now, Trump's greatest weakness is he didn't focus enough on prices, on costs, on affordability. That instead he got sidetracked by issues that did not matter. And in fact, I want to acknowledge something. I'm going to go back to that presidential debate that clearly she did relatively well and he did relatively poorly. In the end, it did not matter. I thought the debate performance would cost him his candidacy. Wow. And instead, it actually did not matter. And that's another learning that America has to face, that even when you put two candidates side by side, the outcome does not necessarily matter in who wins for president.
Really great to have you back, Frank. Frank Luntz, founder, CEO, FIL, and just the voice we were looking to hear today. Thanks for being with us throughout this entire campaign here on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power. We're live in New York at Bloomberg World Headquarters. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lines here in Manhattan this day after, with votes still being counted, and we could see some Senate races still be called even as soon as today because the votes are nearly counted in some of the blue wall states we've been looking at. As we mentioned with Frank as well, we're going to be hearing from Kamala Harris a bit later on today. Kaylee, that's roughly 3 hours from right now on the East Coast, and we'll bring those remarks to you live here on Bloomberg.
Yep, she's planning to speak at 4 p.m. Eastern time, right around the time that markets will close, the equity market at least, which we would remind you is ripping and roaring today in the aftermath of this declared Trump victory. The S&P 500 at a fresh record high, north of 5,900, up 2.2%. The NASDAQ 100 up 2.3%. Big move in the bond market as well. The 10-year yield up 16 basis points on the session to 443, a record high for Bitcoin, a stronger dollar, and the Associated Press just now calling Michigan for Donald Trump. It'll add to his electoral count, but of course this race was already over. He is the president-elect, and we'll have more in the next hour on Bloomberg TV and radio.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from New York.
From Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York City to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lines. It is the day after Election Day, and Donald Trump is the president-elect, will be the 47th president of the United States after already having the Electoral College called for him. But we are seeing him add to his total electoral vote count. The Associated Press just calling the state of Michigan for Donald Trump, bringing his total tally to 292 electoral votes. And Joe, that is the final brick in the blue wall. All three of those states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, called for Trump. In addition to North Carolina and Georgia, we're still awaiting the final results from Nevada and Arizona, but it looks like this could very well be a full sweep of the swing states.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be calling this the blue wall for a lot longer here based on what we're seeing here and Donald Trump creeping ever closer to 300 electoral votes. Let's bring you to Florida now, where, of course, this all culminated last evening with Donald Trump's victory speech. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall was there with us in West Palm Beach. She's still on the ground this day after. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. I was there at the Palm Beach Convention Center where now President-elect Trump declared victory, addressing his supporters, calling this the, quote, greatest political movement of all time. As you have been covering, this is widely considered to be a political comeback for the former president. And I just want to take a step back and talk about some of the events that led us up to Election Day. While we did talk about how the former president, now president-elect, didn't necessarily shy away from some of his more controversial rhetoric, it did appear clear that his campaign was crystallizing around what he called a simple question in the run-up to the election. He started all of his rallies in that week before Election Day, asking voters, are they better off today than they were 4 years ago? And I can tell you our most recent Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll leading into the election found that 68% of likely voters in those critical battleground states said that the country was on the wrong track. This was clearly something that the Trump campaign was able to tap into, because we often talk about how despite some of these more bright spots when it comes to economic indicators, for example, 6 out of 7 of those battleground states have unemployment below pre-pandemic levels. Price pressures and the economy still remain the top issues in some of these places, like Michigan just called minutes ago and Wisconsin early this morning. And this was the type of issue that we see probably and likely helped propel now President-elect Trump to the presidency. Now, just quickly, I do want to add that when we talk about an economic agenda, regardless of who is the president, they need congressional buy-in. That is why it was so critical to Republicans to win the Senate last night. Joe and Kaylee, the House, of course, still too close to call, but I can tell you that I saw House Speaker Mike Johnson up there on the stage last night, and he remains here in Palm Beach today.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall doing great work down in Florida. Thank you so much. And Tyler giving a shout out to our Bloomberg News Morning Consult swing state polling that we had going for the last year of this cycle. And spearheading that for us here at Bloomberg is senior editor in Washington, Wendy Benjaminson, who is joining us now. Wendy, obviously you and the team have done great work on this, and our poll consistently indicated that this thing was going to be close, that the swing states were going to be very difficult to call. And at the end of the day, it does look like Donald Trump may have picked up every single one of them. What do we take away from this?
Well, that analysis is exactly right, Kaylee. And what happened was, I think the poll was actually pretty accurate in that it always said the margin between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in each of these 7 states was within the margin of error, which was within 1 or 2 points, depending on the state, 4 points for some of the smaller states like Nevada. And look at the results. The results, I mean, Trump won, but by very narrow margins. The idea was, though, that he wasn't going to win all 7 swing states. So that was the big surprise last night, was that he actually won all 7 of them, bringing him that big electoral prize you were just talking about. So the poll was accurate. The theory that she would have picked up some of those states is what turned out not to happen.
Wendy, Vice President Kamala Harris is about to perform a very delicate act. When she speaks at 4 p.m., we'll carry her remarks here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Having not spoken at all last night, she sent her supporters home without hearing from the nominee. And Wendy, we've talked about the rhetoric in this campaign. Kamala Harris has made clear that another Donald Trump administration would be the end of democracy as we know it. Now, I don't know if you think she has a political future beyond this campaign, but what must she say today?
Well, I believe that what her staff will be guiding her to, and what she will know from her own political instincts, is to today tone it down a bit. You know, the worst thing she could do is come out there, angry and resentful. We saw a little of that in 2016 at Hillary Clinton's first appearance on election night. I think if you recall, she looked like she'd been very upset and angry, and she came out and gave this sort of angry speech about losing to Donald Trump, and then she sort of pulled it together the next day. So the fact that Kamala Harris waited a day was probably a wise move, and to begin to say that he's been elected and it's time for Democrats to do their best to perhaps, if she wants to say something like this, stop his worst instincts, and to try to govern, as best they can in the government we're going to have.
Well, that then becomes the question, Wendy, of checks and balances. The Senate will be there with Donald Trump. It is a Republican majority. The question remains the House. How much does the majority in the House and the size of the Senate majority, which is still in question at this hour, ultimately matter to how much of Donald Trump's agenda comes to fruition?
It's the ballgame, Kelly. I mean, if Republicans maintain control of the House and you have a comfortable margin in the Senate, even though we believe Senators Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins will stand as sort of try to be the guardrails against some of the more extreme policies that might be proposed. But this means all of Trump's nominees for cabinet posts and such will be confirmed. He will probably be a little strategic. There are some people whose names are being floated around who might have too many skeletons in the closet, even for the Republican MAGA Senate. In the House, that means he can get his tax agenda through, he can get his budget priorities through, his immigration policies through, if Republicans control the Senate. What does often happen, and what happened in 2018, is that you will have one-party government for 2 years, and then the midterms will happen, and the voters usually start having some kind of buyer's remorse. This happens whether the government is Democratic or Republican. They start thinking, did I really vote for that? And then, oftentimes in the midterms where congressional elections are held, that is when you can get a new Congress that might, take a different tack.
It's great to have you with us this day after Wendy. Bloomberg senior editor in Washington, Wendy Benjaminson, with us on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Either way you cut it here, Kayleigh, we've got news that is still breaking. If you're just joining us, the state of Michigan has gone for Donald Trump, and we're still watching a couple of important Senate races there. It's not just the top of the ticket here, Kayleigh. It's amazing to see what is largely a red wave wash over Capitol Hill as well. We could be in a world, and we don't know this yet, that Donald Trump has a true sweep.
Yeah, of course, we're still awaiting results in the West for some of those swing states, and we're also awaiting the results of the Senate races in the blue wall states. Right now, as we speak, 99% of the vote count in total is in Michigan, and Alyssa Slotkin is up against Mike Rogers by just 0.3 of a percentage point. The margin is incredibly tight. Then you go to Pennsylvania. Dave McCormick is up 49.1% to Bob Casey's 48.4% with 97% of the votes in. And in Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin is holding on to about a 1-point lead, 49.4%. Eric Hovde's 48.5%. 99% of the votes are in there, but all three, Joe, still too close to call right now.
Could drop on us while we're on the air here now, which is a great opportunity to bring in Cook Political Report Senate and Governor's editor Jessica Taylor. This is Jessica's specialty, and Jessica, it's great to have you back. You've probably been up all night as well. Your expectation, now that we've seen Michigan be called by the Associated Press on the presidential level, what happens to this Senate race?
I think that when I look at, like you said, almost all of the vote count is in. I was talking with my sources, both Democratic and Republican, this morning. They were waiting on Wayne County to come in there, and they expected that would break pretty heavily for Slotkin. If I'm on 1 hour of sleep, so it looks like she's ahead by about 18,000 votes right now. I think that's probably hard to overcome at this point. As you mentioned, it's very close, but I think that she's probably going to hold on there. So that's a hold there. In the Senate race. In Wisconsin, we don't have that race called yet either. But again, based on what I'm seeing and talking to my sources, they expect that Tammy Baldwin is going to win a very, very close race there, even as, again, Trump has won the state. The one that's most surprising to me is Pennsylvania. You were mentioning another very close race David McCormick is in, is leading Democratic Senator Bob Casey there. When I look at where the outstanding vote is, there were some vote tabulation machine malfunctions in Cambria County, which is Johnstown, and that's a very Republican stronghold. There are some still outstanding absentee ballots in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia, but once we get that Cambria County vote in, I don't think it's going to be enough for Casey to make up the difference in those bigger population centers. So again, not called yet. We don't know what the results are going to be till they finally come in. But I would much rather be McCormick in this instance. And in those other races, I do think that Democrats are going to hold on to Michigan and Wisconsin.
Well, and then there's Nevada, Jessica. Right now, 84% of the votes are in. Sam Brown, the Republican challenger, is up 0.1 of a percentage point right now against the incumbent Jackie Rosen. We're talking a margin here of less than 1,000 votes. I don't know if you have a strong feeling about what way this goes ultimately when all the counts are in. But for this race and some of the others we were just talking about, what's the likelihood of recounts and potential legal challenges here?
I think in Nevada, I think Democrats were always sort of preparing for, and Republicans were for, I think, some very late counting because they have to sort of cure ballots. There's absentee ballots that could certainly face legal challenges and things too. Again, when I look at sort of the outstanding vote, Rosen is leading there, and most of the vote is still left in Washoe, which is Reno. and in Clark County, which is Las Vegas. I would rather be her in this instance, but again, I think it's going to be very, very close. This was a race I was hearing from Republicans that they felt like was breaking their way pretty late, largely because of the presidential race there, even though Rosen had a pretty substantial lead for much of the race. So again, this is another one. So I think by my count right now, Republicans have at least a 52-48 majority. That means they flipped West Virginia, which we knew, they flipped Ohio, and they flipped Montana. Those were the ones that we expected more. They flipped Pennsylvania like I expect that they will. That's 53. So Nevada, maybe that could be 54.
Wow. Well, Jessica, if a rising tide lifts all boats, Kari Lake sprung a leak somewhere. And I'm wondering what you thought about this. Ruben Gallego, the Democrat, on a night like that, taking a lead over such a well-known Republican candidate, former TV news anchor, closely associated with Donald Trump. Where did she go wrong?
She was well known, and that was her problem. She came in with very high negatives from that 2022 gubernatorial race. Mitch McConnell gave a press conference on Capitol Hill earlier today. They asked him what his takeaway was from the Senate races. He said candidate quality matters. That's why they feel like they got strong candidates there in Pennsylvania with David McCormick, and races there in Montana as well. Kari Lake was not a strong candidate. We knew this going in, that she was a very polarizing figure. She came in high negatives, was never really able to overcome them, never really sort of, in that race for governor, she insulted sort of McCain voters and those swing voters there in Maricopa County that makes up over 60% of the vote. Gallego ran a very smart race. He was able to spend early on. He had the spending advantage. He was able to introduce himself there, even in a state where he was more progressive than the state's other senator, Mike Kelly, that ran as more of a centrist. So he was able to tell his story, being raised in poverty by a single mother, going on to be in the Marines. So I think that also we saw him do better with the types of voters that Donald Trump was doing better with Latino men and Black men. So those were the split ticket voters. But also those independents broke against Kari Lake, and I think it's because she was sort of the wrong candidate for the moment in Arizona.
Well, as we consider the idea of split ticketing, you look at a state, considering you follow gubernatorial races as well, like North Carolina, which of course Donald Trump won by a margin of about 4 points or a little under that. Josh Stein, the Democratic candidate for governor, won by 14 points in North Carolina. What's the takeaway there, Jessica?
Again, the candidates matter. And you had the lieutenant governor there that Republicans, many of them knew early on, was a very controversial candidate. And then you had a scandal that came out about allegedly posting on a porn site and talking about being a black Nazi. Republicans largely abandoned him. He didn't have much of a campaign infrastructure to begin with. He was off air on advertising for the last 2 months of the campaign, basically. But I think also voters do look at a vote for governor and a vote for Senate very differently. Actually, in the last 100 years there in North Carolina, they've only elected a Republican governor 3 times. So they are used to splitting their tickets. And in fact, even as Trump carried the state in 2016 and in 2020, Roy Cooper won both times. But actually, apart from the top of the ticket at the presidential level, some North Carolina Democrats were having a pretty good night. And I think that was sort of Stein helping them. They've broken the supermajority in the state legislature. They won the attorney general's race. Democrats have kept that seat. And then they also won a Secretary of Public Instruction, basically the Secretary of Education there, that was also with a very controversial Republican candidate.
All right, Jessica, I want to talk leadership with you here. Now that we're looking at a red Senate here, and I guess to your point, we could still add a couple more to the list. There is a thought with Donald Trump on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue that this is not the race we thought it was to replace Mitch McConnell, that Steve Daines could even be drafted late in the game here. We're only a couple of weeks out from this. What's about to happen?
Daines did give an interview with Semaphore where he did say, again, he would not be drafted. He was not interested in doing this. I wouldn't be surprised to see him in leadership in some position, especially after having a very strong showing for Senate Republicans. He was my dark horse, but like I said, he gave that interview to Burgess Everett there, Semaphore, last week, and said that he would not be there. So we have the 2 of the Johns, John Thune of South Dakota and John Cornyn of Texas. Now, they have had a rockier relationship with Trump. Rick Scott of Florida has also thrown his name in there. Now, he had a bigger than expected victory after having sort of very narrow wins for governor and for Senate. But he also had a very controversial tenure at the top of the National Republican Senatorial Committee in 2022 when they actually lost a seat. So I think it's going to be a lot of jockeying behind the scenes. I think probably still Thune or Cornyn have the inside slot. But like you said, is there another candidate that emerges? Perhaps 2.
All right, Jessica Taylor. the Cook Political Report Senate and Governor's editor. Thank you so much for joining us on this day after. I would reiterate, the Senate majority has been decided. Republicans will be in control. There will be a new Republican leader. We just don't know the size of the majority that person will be leading, as we're still awaiting the results from a number of these contests that remain too close to call in some of these battleground states, the Blue Wall and in Nevada. And of course, we could still be days away at this point from figuring out who controls the House of Representatives.
That's a whole different animal here. By the way, Governor Mike DeWine is going to have to pick a replacement for J.D. Vance. That'll be another part of the Senate picture that has yet to be fulfilled, and we'll be talking about that along with the leadership battle in the weeks ahead here. Either way you cut it, red wave playing big on Wall Street, if we can call it a wave. My goodness, to see the S&P 500 holding up well over 2%, the Dow's up over 3%. The VIX is gone. Look at that, down 20% to a 16 handle today as investors breathe a sigh of relief.
Yeah, and I just want to give a shout out to small caps here as well. Obviously, a proxy for Trump-oriented trades. The Russell 2000 index up 5.25% on the day, now at the highest we have seen since November of 2021. So we're talking about 3 years here. And of course, a lot is being pushed through this bond market right now. Not only the results of this election, but awaiting the results of the Federal Reserve decision and Jerome Powell press conference tomorrow. Yields are up all across the curve. We're up 14 on the 10-year Treasury yield right now at 4.41. The markets are reacting in a big, big way. And of course, we'll continue to keep that covered here on Bloomberg.
You said it. Interest rates down. Pretty remarkable to see with stocks up today, and we'll keep tabs on this for you as we work our way through this afternoon with still races to be called in the Senate, as we just discussed with Jessica. But another state falls Trump just this hour, Michigan to Donald Trump on the way forward. What will it mean for foreign policy? Hagar Chemali of Greenwich Media Strategies will be with us next with our eye to the Middle East. This is Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from World Headquarters in New York. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lines, and Donald Trump is the president-elect, having won the Electoral College. That is not completely called yet, but he, of course, picked up the state of Michigan, according to the Associated Press, just within the last half hour, now at 292 electoral votes. Even before that full count has come in, Joe, obviously we've heard from Donald Trump himself, who spoke in the early hours from West Palm Beach in Florida, thanking his supporters for his victory. We have not yet heard from Vice President Kamala Harris, though she is expected to speak from Howard University in Washington, D.C., just about 3.5 hours from now at 4 p.m. Eastern time.
That's right. We'll take her remarks, of course, live and unfiltered here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We understand she has yet to phone Donald Trump to concede the race, but will today. And as Kaylee mentioned, 4 p.m. Eastern. So we're just a little more than a couple of hours out now for a speech that many thought should have happened last evening. But of course, there was so much noise in the numbers and not enough states officially called in the waking hours, at least. We got into the wee hours. By the time we came off the air at 3:30 a.m., it was pretty clear what was happening. Donald Trump delivering his victory speech. And there are questions, Kaylee, not only about domestic policy, but what this means for the Middle East, what it means for Ukraine, what it means for Africa, with so much tough talk on the campaign trail and a president who approaches foreign policy in many ways as he does business. To that end, we're joined by Hagar Chemali, the former director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council, CEO and founder of Greenwich Media Strategies. Hagar, I wonder your thoughts today if the world will be a safer or more dangerous place under a Trump 2.0.
I mean, overall, listen, there are going to be pros and cons on foreign policy from either candidate. And I think it just depends on the region. In the Middle East, to be perfectly frank, I expect things to be safer. And that is because Trump is tough with Iran and tougher with Iran. Iran is more afraid of Trump because of his unpredictability, and Iran is at the root of all the problems in the Middle East. But when it comes to Ukraine and Russia, it may not be the same, because any deal that he's going to strike prematurely is going to possibly incentivize Russia and other dictators to take more land grabs and things of that kind. And with China, it could, when it comes to Taiwan, I'm not as worried. But when it comes to a trade war and what that could do to the global economy, I am. So it's a little inconsistent. I'm sorry, it's not a straight yes or no answer.
Okay, so let's take each of these one by one and dig in a little bit more, Hagar. We, of course, have heard from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who in the early hours last night put out a statement congratulating Trump on what he called history's greatest comeback, going on to say your historic return to the White House offers a new beginning for America and a powerful recommitment to the great alliance between Israel and America. What do those words, recommitment and a new beginning, mean to you when it comes to this relationship, Hagar?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this is a little bit, to be honest with you, slightly offensive from Prime Minister Netanyahu, because President Biden and the Biden administration in general really, after October 7, really invested in the relationship, was really there for Israel. And so Netanyahu should not try to imply that it wasn't good and that now there's some kind of restart or renewal. The U.S.-Israeli relationship has always been strong. Surely there are going to be differences from any candidate and any administration. That said, Trump was very pro-Israel when he was in office the first time. He pursued policies, for example, that no administration, whether Republican or Democrat, had pursued. For example, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, observing the annexation, recognizing the annexation of the Golan Heights, and also declaring that settlements in the West Bank were not illegal. These were major steps, very, very pro-Israel steps. And that is what Netanyahu is looking at, is that those are very in line with Netanyahu's views, his right-wing cabinet as well. And that's what he meant, was that he views in Trump a candidate that's going to support Netanyahu's policies and moves no matter what they are.
Well, so does this mean the tit for tat between Israel and Iran, the military tit for tat, is over for now? Or could this be a dangerous lame duck session until Donald Trump takes office?
Trump's talking point to Israel has been that he wants the war, quote, wrapped up by January, by the time Trump takes office. And what he means by that is do what you have to do. He doesn't seem to care what Israel does. He said, do what you have to do, but get it done, because he doesn't want to have to handle this or deal with it on his watch. And the reason for that, by the way, is that in the order of national security threats around the world, the Middle East might feature as number 3 or 4. And he doesn't want to be distracted by that. He wants to focus on China. He wants to focus on North Korea. He wants to focus on AI or technology and advancement into space and things of that kind. That's how Trump views things. And so he wants it wrapped up. But when it comes to Iran specifically, Trump is, as you recall, the Trump administration assassinated Qasem Soleimani, at the time the general of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And by the way, the reason for Iran's foreign policy across the Middle East that seeks to destabilize the Middle East by supporting militant groups and terrorist groups. And Iran is very aware of that. That is a language they understand, and that is a red line they understand. And so they might go back on their heels. And so if I sum it up, my view is that Trump is thinking, I don't care what you do, just wrap it up, finish this so that we can focus on the bigger problem, which is Iran, which is at the root of all of these issues.
Well, he wants to see things wrapped up in Ukraine as well, by all accounts. Hagar, we did hear from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky put out a statement of his own congratulating Trump, saying he looks forward to an era of strong United States of America under President Trump's decisive leadership. Then says, we rely on continued strong bipartisan support for Ukraine in the United States. Hagar, that bipartisan support may well be there. There are pro-Ukraine Republicans, as there are Democrats. It becomes a question of if any of those voices collectively can outweigh the voices on the other side, including that of Donald Trump and the Vice President-elect, J.D. Vance.
Yeah, so Ukraine is where I have a few more concerns, and that's really largely because of the NATO alliance, because Trump is not a fan of NATO and NATO is not a fan of Trump. And that is why earlier this year at the NATO summit, they sought to Trump-proof NATO by announcing the intention of inviting Ukraine to become a member. That was why it was in anticipation of a possible Trump administration. On the question of aid, Trump's policies and J.D. Vance have been very clear on this. They don't want further Ukraine aid. They want to strike a negotiated settlement as soon as possible. And Trump always says he could do it within 24 hours. He could do it before he even takes office. Trump's argument is that he would tell Ukraine, I'm not going to give you more aid, and therefore you're going to be forced to strike a deal, and that he would tell Putin, if you don't strike a deal on your end, I'm going to give more aid to Ukraine. And that's, again, and by the way, Trump is going to pursue this type of business-making, deal-making behavior with every kind of foreign policy. But doesn't Vladimir Putin know that if we have a Republican Congress, it's not likely another dollar's going to Ukraine? That's my view. I think that there is bipartisan support, but it was tough. I mean, we already saw it with House Speaker Ryan and how he withheld Ukraine aid, and he did so successfully for several months, and it had a very big impact on the ground in Ukraine. And so I don't rely too much. I don't have a lot of hope for Congress to hold back Trump and J.D. Vance. Maybe there might be some more, some compromises made. Zelensky made a smart move by meeting with Trump when he was here during the UN General Assembly in September. But overall, I think Trump is going to charge ahead with his effort to limit Ukraine aid and force some kind of negotiated settlement, which in the grand scheme of things is extremely concerning because that kind of throws a bone or gives a win to Russia for sure.
Well, so as we consider the actors here, Russia, Iran, which we've just discussed, obviously we've had extensive conversations on the connection between those two, and a third actor, which is China. Hagar, what worries you most when we consider the future of China policy? Potentially the decoupling of an economic relationship, or what could happen in the Taiwan Strait?
So this is a fascinating one because Biden actually continued Trump's China policies, but it was couched differently. It was messaged differently. From the Republican side, the message is China is the biggest threat we face, and we want to decouple completely. And from the Democrat side, it's we're in competition. We want to diversify our supply chains because they don't want to land in a trade war. Trump's policies seem to go more toward that route of a trade war, especially since he has said that he intends to impose 60% tariffs on all imports from China. I'm not sure he's going to be able, to be honest with you, to reach 60%, perhaps on certain things like electric vehicles, pharmaceuticals, things of this kind that he has talked about. But at the end of the day, China is also one of our biggest markets for our U.S. exports. And so starting a trade war could really undermine many different economic aspects and also increase inflation significantly here. So that said, I do think he's going to charge ahead with this because he has said so, and that could have economic ramifications that are global beyond, in general, by the way. If it harms China's economy, it also harms China's ability to buy goods from our neighbors. Anyway, so that's on that front. But on the part about Taiwan, when you mentioned the Taiwan Strait, again, as with the Iranian regime, all dictators view Trump as erratic and unpredictable. And even Trump himself said that. And so they are very careful to take moves that could trigger U.S. military engagement. And on Taiwan in particular, Mike Pompeo, who remains a supporter of Trump, is a very loud supporter of Taiwan, even going so far as to call for Taiwan's independence. And so I don't expect things to get hairy on the China-Taiwan front with Trump in office. I do on the economic front, albeit Trump's motive is to improve U.S. manufacturing and the economy here. I think that these moves could be very risky in the end.
All right, Hagar Chemali of Greenwich Media Strategies, formerly of the National Security Council, thank you so much for joining us. And we're certainly seeing the market try to price out what the future of the relationship with China could look like. Overnight, we saw the biggest move for a weaker yuan since October of 2022, weakening, of course, against the dollar, as we've seen a lot of currencies do in the aftermath of this result. And it's not just the dollar on the move, it is equities, bonds, cryptocurrencies as well. So let's get a look at the markets with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Abigail?
Well, that is true, Kelly. It really is an overall risk rally. Markets responding very well to President Trump, Donald Trump being elected the next president, the 47th president of the United States. We have the S&P 500 right now at session highs, a record high, in fact. And from a technical perspective, it really made up a lot of lost ground because a near-term uptrend had actually been broken. That's a long way of saying that in some ways the impossible has been done, now up 2.4% after yesterday's greater than 1% rally. It has to do with the certainty around the president, but it also has to do with the anticipation around what his policies are likely to be. Protectionist, the tariffs, lower taxes, all of this has different sectors trading higher, in particular banks doing very well. That KBW Bank Index up more than 10%, the best day since 2020. On the other hand, you have real estate and some of the dividend-sensitive sectors. Those are lower, but DJT, Tesla, whatever way you go, for the most part, you do have stocks responding well on the idea that a rising tide of an economy that could be helped by lower taxes and these other protectionist policies could, in fact, help most stocks.
Interesting to see what's lower today, Abigail, in our remaining moments. First, solar Solar stocks are taking it hard. First Solar is down 11%. The idea of undoing parts of the IRA, and the MJ ETF, the cannabis ETF, is down 18%. Apparently, we're turning away from legalization.
It is pretty interesting. And what really caught my eye in terms of the laggards confirming the Trump trade, China. You and your last guest were just talking about China, the possibility of 60% of imports being placed under tariffs. That NASDAQ Golden Dragon Index down about 2%. The Hang Seng had been down. Plus, Bloomberg Commodity Index, that is down. China, the world's largest user of natural resources. Overall, this is a piece of the Trump trade. The markets are being very clear in terms of their messaging around Donald Trump as the next president.
Been a wild day on the markets, going back to the wee hours. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for the insights. Coming up, Bloomberg's The Close anchor Romaine Bostick in Detroit, with Michigan now in the Trump column. It's next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from World Headquarters in New York. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew, and Donald Trump is the president-elect. And Kamala Harris, according to sources familiar, has recognized that. We're just getting fresh reporting in from senior Harris aides that Vice President Harris has called President-elect Trump to congratulate him on winning the 2024 presidential election. They say she discussed the importance of a peaceful transfer of power and being a president for all Americans. And of course, we will hear the words from Kamala Harris herself just over 2 hours from now. She is scheduled to speak at Howard University at 4 p.m. Eastern Time.
That was supposed to be the venue for her speech and celebration last evening in Washington, and thousands of Kamala Harris supporters did gather at her alma mater, eventually told to go back home, saying they were still counting votes, and the vice president wanted to give this some time to breathe. We're done breathing on the presidential race. By the time Donald Trump spoke, and what I believe was the 2 a.m. hour Eastern Time from West Palm Beach, Florida, it was clear that he would be the president-elect. Since we've taken air today, the state of Michigan has fallen into the Donald Trump category. We still have a couple of more states to call here, specifically when it comes to Senate races. But of course, Kaylee, Michigan was almost as big a prize as Pennsylvania in the blue wall.
15 electoral votes, of course. And yes, that is the third brick in the blue wall that went for Donald Trump. He swept Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, add Georgia and North Carolina to that list, and he is currently leading in the two other battleground states of Nevada and Arizona. So it is entirely possible that he wins all 7. And of course, we're awaiting Senate results, as you mentioned, Joe, in some of those very same states as we speak.
That's right. We'll let you know as these races are called, of course. Romaine Bostick joined us earlier from Detroit. He's been on the ground in Michigan for the close of this campaign, referring to the red wake-up call. Romaine, Michigan is now in the bag.
Absolutely here. I'm actually standing right now in central Detroit. It's a beautiful day here, though the mood not so much. Of course, this is a Democratic stronghold, not just the city of Detroit, but Wayne County, the county that encompasses the city. Both candidates spent a lot of time in this county, but they did it in 2 very different ways. While Kamala Harris made the rounds, big rallies, and of course stopping by the local diners and local businesses, Trump actually flanked out to the edges of this county. The predominantly Arab and Muslim populations in Dearborn and Dearborn Heights, Hamtramck, and a few other places. He also fanned out into some of the Jewish enclaves a little bit further north of here. And he really spent a lot of time there, not just in big rallies, but really going into barbershops, going into local communities and talking with people one-on-one. I had a chance to talk to a major Democratic pollster here in the state of Michigan, as well as one of the main surrogates for Donald Trump. I just got off the phone with them just about 30 minutes ago, and I asked them both what actually went wrong for the Harris campaign. And both of them had an incredibly similar, unprompted response. He said it wasn't so much about what went wrong with the Harris campaign, but it was about what went right with the Trump campaign here.
Romaine, I just want to break in here with some breaking news. According to the Associated Press, one of these Senate seats has been called. The incumbent Democratic senator, according to the AP, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, has won her race against her Republican challenger, Mr. Hovde, according to the Associated Press. So that is one Senate seat in which Democrats have held. As we consider the size of the Senate majority here, Romaine, Eric Hovde has lost that race to Tammy Baldwin. In Michigan, though, where you are, that Senate race still is too close to call. The Democrat Alyssa Slotkin is only up by about 0.3 of a percentage point right now against Mike Rogers, her Republican opponent, with 99% of the votes in. Where should we watch for those remaining votes to come in as we figure out who won this thing?
There are still some mail-in absentee ballots that has to be cast. I couldn't get an accurate count of exactly how many are out there, but the differential right now between Rogers and Slotkin is only really just a few thousand votes here. I was also told by that same pollster that I talked to on the Trump side that they are anticipating that there could be a legal battle over this no matter what the state declares, whether it's today or in the days that follows. And he meant, when he said legal battles, he doesn't just mean from the Republican side. The Democrats could also challenge the results too. So it's quite possible that we might not know the full outcome of this particular Senate race here in the state of Michigan. Of course, if Mike Rogers were to actually win that race for the Senate seat, he would be the first Republican senator from the state of Michigan since 2001 and only the second since the 1960s.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostic.
How's that for a blue wall?
Yeah, the blue wall not looking very blue at this time. Live in Detroit, Romaine, thank you so much. Of course, another element of that is the state of Pennsylvania. The Senate race there, too, remains too close to call. 97% of votes counted. Dave McCormick, the Republican challenger to the incumbent Democrat Bob Casey, is currently up by 0.3 of a percentage point. If we get a call in that race, we will, of course, bring it to you. But the state of Pennsylvania, Joe, has been the one that has been in focus this entire cycle, not just because of this Senate race, but because of the 19 electoral votes it brings, which now have gone, obviously, to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump last night, when speaking in West Palm Beach, Florida, gave a little credit to someone, perhaps, for the performance in Pennsylvania. That person would be Elon Musk.
Let me tell you, we have a new star. A star is born, Elon. Now he is. Now he's an amazing guy. We were sitting together tonight. You know, he spent 2 weeks in Philadelphia and different parts of Pennsylvania campaigning.
Let's go to Pennsylvania right now. Michael Berkman is back with us on Balance of Power. He's director of the McCourtney Institute for Democracy and Political Science, professor at Penn State, co-host of the Democracy Works podcast. Professor, welcome back. Last time you were with us, I asked you what it was like if you drove 50 miles in any direction from your campus. Your answer might lead us to what happened in Pennsylvania last night. How did Donald Trump do it?
Trump won everywhere, so far as I can tell. I think there's going to be a lot of emphasis on his strength in rural areas, which was clearly there, and he increased his, I don't know where he found them, but he found more people in rural areas, or at least he did much better than Joe Biden did. But, you know, looking at the map, he did well everywhere.
Well, yeah, I'm looking at the parts of the map that we consider to be bellwethers. Northampton County, of course, has selected the statewide presidential winner in Pennsylvania in every election for, 80 years now, I believe, Professor. And Northampton County, of course, broke for Donald Trump. So, too, did Bucks County. And when we consider Pennsylvania as being part of the blue wall, I wonder if looking at the results in these margins in the state, if you would still consider blue wall something that we should be saying right now.
Well, maybe not. I mean, my sense has been that the blue wall will probably break down over the next, 10, 15 years as the states kind of age out and Sunbelt becomes a more vibrant area and Democrats see some strength there, which has clearly happened over the last several cycles, even though they didn't win today. But I'm not that surprised to see it all go this way and to see all the states run in basically the same direction in the blue wall.
Tell us why. There was a thought that many pollsters had that if even there was a 1% error in each direction, that it could lead to a landslide. Help our listeners and viewers understand that.
Right. I heard that from a lot of people, too. And I think there was a lot to it, that if that the battleground states were not going to split 4-3.
Yeah.
That they were either going to go 6-1 or 7-0 for one person because a polling error would likely be across the board. And I think that's what we've seen, although, not that far off from the polls. They had her directionally it was off because I had her up by 2 points or so. I don't know what his final number will be. So they picked the wrong winner, but the percentage that he's going to get is not that far off from where the polls are showing.
Amazing.
Well, so as we consider that, there's obviously among Democrats right now, Professor, a lot of Wednesday morning quarterbacking going on, a lot of pointing the fingers of blame as to where exactly this campaign for Kamala Harris went wrong. And there's questions around whether one of those wrong turns was in the selection of Tim Walz as her vice presidential running mate, as opposed to Governor Josh Shapiro. Do you think that would have made a difference?
Not really. I think I read this election as a whole-scale rejection of the Biden administration. Wow. And, Biden needed to get out earlier. He needed to allow a primary process to operate so that Democrats could create an identity separate from Biden. That was not going to be possible with Harris, and she can never get out from underneath, I think, mainly the effects of inflation.
Okay, hold that thought. Josh Shapiro could also be a major contender 4 years from now. Was it actually good for him in his own political fortune to not be part of this?
It's a long time off. I think the thought was that Josh Shapiro could win Pennsylvania even by not being on the ticket. Had he been on the ticket, I'm not convinced it would have made that much of a difference. But had it, I don't know that it would have made a difference in Michigan and Wisconsin as well.
Well, that's a fair point. Pennsylvania was only one piece of this puzzle. And as we keep reiterating, this puzzle does look a lot more red than it does blue when you're looking at the electoral map, with a few states still have left to be called, and a few Senate races still to be called as well. It is very tight between McCormick and Casey, the incumbent Democrat. Professor, what will it mean, though, if someone, and Joe says this frequently, with the Casey name loses in Pennsylvania?
The Democrats lost several statewide races in yesterday's election. So I'm not surprised Casey went down. I thought maybe his name was gonna keep him afloat, but it could be a sense in an anti-incumbent election or an anti-establishment election that somebody who's been around for as many years as Casey and his family have been, the voters tell him it's time to go. But keep in mind, he is running a bit ahead of Biden. So there was some strength there for him, but overall, it was just overwhelming in the state, everywhere.
I'm supposed to ask you, Professor, what Kamala Harris is going to say or should say when she delivers, I guess, her concession speech later on today. She's going to talk at 4 p.m., and we do have reporting now that she has called Donald Trump to concede. I'm more curious what you're going to tell your students when you get them back in class and what you expect to hear from them.
Well, that's tomorrow. I'm going to emphasize the peaceful transition of power. I think that's what Kamala Harris is going to model. I think she already has by calling Trump and graciously conceding and wishing him the best. That didn't necessarily happen last time.
Yeah.
So I'll emphasize that. I do think there will be, a fair number of students who are somewhat grieving over losing their first presidential election, including one that they probably didn't think they were about to lose. Sure, we'll talk about that, but mostly I want to put up this map that shows the changes from 2020 and emphasize that this was a victory across the board. So in other words, I don't think you can point to any particular demographic group. I don't think you can point to any particular campaign decision that Kamala Harris made. I don't even think you can point to the Kamala Harris campaign. This was a wholesale rejection of the administration. There was no way for her to get out from under that, or at least she couldn't figure that out.
And finally, before we let you go, Professor, there were obviously a number of House races we were watching in Pennsylvania as well. Many of them have not been called yet, as the House has not been called in its entirety right now. Given what we're seeing in Pennsylvania, what we've seen across the map, would you bet on a red sweep when all is said and done?
Oh, of all the House races, it could well be. I have to tell you, I haven't looked carefully enough at the ones that are still outstanding. I fully expect the House is going to go red. It seems like a pretty narrow path for the Democrats to retain it. Pennsylvania may end up losing all of its blue seats. Except for inside of Philadelphia. They'll retain those seats. Yeah.
All right, Penn State political science professor Michael Berkman, thank you so much for joining us on this day after the election as we're continuing to get news in and races called. The Associated Press, having just in the last 10 minutes or so called one of the remaining Senate seats that was in question, the incumbent Democratic senator in Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin, will hold on to her seat. But again, as we've reiterated, Pennsylvania, that Senate race too close to call, Wisconsin too close to call, Nevada still too close to call.
With the eye on Michigan, we're going to be joined in the late edition of Balance of Power by Congresswoman Haley Stevens, Democrat, who stumped hard for Kamala Harris in Detroit and throughout the state. Of course, someone with close ties to the auto industry following the recovery out of the Great Recession, a conversation that will bring us another view in this day that continues to evolve. And we'll also speak with the former Ambassador James Jeffrey K. Kaylee, we can't underscore the geopolitical implications. This is a huge domestic policy story, but the geopolitical implications are massive, and we're going to touch both of those themes tonight.
And of course, we'll have reaction to the expected concession speech of Vice President Kamala Harris at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, a Harris aide has said she has already called Donald Trump to concede this race and congratulate him on his victory. But this market saw a Trump victory long before she acknowledged it, and even the map looked that way before this race was called. As we're seeing stocks higher across the board, big move in the small caps, the S&P 500 at a record, the 10-year yield up 15 basis points to 442, and a headline just crossing the Bloomberg terminal reporting from ABC that President Biden will speak with Trump today and plans to address the nation on Thursday. That is tomorrow. So clearly still a lot more for this, for these markets and for us to look forward to, Joe.
Yeah, but as Kaylee mentioned, before we get that far, we'll hear from the vice president. That's set for about 2 hours from now, 4 p.m. Eastern time. So do join us then. We'll be with you for each turn as this election night 2024 turns into election week. In some cases, that will be the case for the House. More Senate races falling today as we speak, and we'll have a lot more for you later here on Balance of Power, the fastest show in politics post-election on Bloomberg TV and radio.